Good morning.
My lady, before we begin hearing evidence today, there is a correction to be put on the record. In response to a Rule 10 question yesterday, Dr. Llewellyn referred to the impact of austerity on local government over the last 10 years, and he stated that the budget had been cut in real terms by about £900,000. Dr. Llewellyn has clarified that the correct figure is in fact £900 million.
Slight difference.
May I please call Jane Runnacles?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Please could you give your full name?
Jane Sarah Runnacles.
Thank you for attending today and for assisting the inquiry. You have kindly provided 2 witness statements for this module. The first is at INQ 000320679, and this was signed on the 20th of October 2023, and it concerns your role as a special advisor during the pandemic. The second statement is at INQ 000274119, which was signed on the 15th of December 2023, and this concerns your use of informal or private communications. Do both statements remain true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They do.
Thank you. You are the head of the Welsh Government's team of special advisors, a role to which you were appointed in December 2018. Alongside that role, and since the start of the pandemic, you have been the senior special advisor to the First Minister, and you remain in that office today. Is that all correct?
It is.
In terms of your background and career, you began working for the Welsh Civil Service in October 2003 when you were appointed as a special advisor by Rhodri Morgan, who was at that time the First Minister, and you provided direct support to the then Minister for the Environment, Planning and Countryside, as well as the Business Minister. Is that right?
It is.
You remained a special advisor until December 2009 when Rhodri Morgan stepped down as First Minister, and then you then worked part-time for the Wales Trade Union Congress between January 2010 and August 2015. Subsequently, you returned to the Welsh Government as a special advisor on secondment from the Wales TUC to support the then First Minister Carwyn Jones. You then returned to the Welsh Government Special Advisor team as a direct employee of the Welsh Government Civil Service in November 2016. Is that all correct?
It is.
Thank you, Ms. Runnacles. I want to start by asking you some questions about the role of a special advisor within the Welsh Government. As the head of the Special Advisor team, you have responsibility for 14 special advisors. These advisors provide support to the First Minister and to individual Welsh ministers, is that right?
It is.
Please can you briefly describe the roles and responsibilities of a special advisor in the Welsh Government outside of a crisis period such as the pandemic?
The role of a special advisor is set out in the code, the Special Advisor Code, which I've submitted as part of my evidence. It stipulates those areas that we can do, so primarily to convey the views of ministers and their interests to the civil service, to request documents and briefings for them, to hold meetings with civil servants and to engage with the wider civil service and external stakeholders. We also have things we can't do, so we cannot take any statutory or prerogative power decisions. We cannot have any part in decision making around budgets. We cannot have any role in relation to the appointment or management of the civil service staff, and we are there to listen.
Thank you, Ms. Runnacles. So it would be fair to summarise, as the name suggests, that the role of a special advisor is to advise but not to make any decisions.
Absolutely.
Turning now to 2020 onwards and the beginning of the COVID pandemic, Please can you briefly outline how your roles and responsibilities as a special advisor changed?
I don't know that they did change enormously. The fundamentals that I've just described remained true throughout the pandemic period.
Thank you. You explain in your first witness statement that the structure of your team changed during the pandemic and the team was rejigged to respond to the handling of the pandemic response in late March, and 3 new members of the team were introduced. Please could you explain why you restructured your team in this way?
It was clear through March that the workload that the team were having to cope with was increasing steadily, and the First Minister, as a former special advisor himself, suggested that it would be useful to bring in additional support for the team, and the 3 people who we brought into the team at that point were all experienced special advisors and had served under previous First Ministers. I also asked 2 members of the team to take a kind of more supervisory role in a way that isn't ordinarily the case in the special advisor team. So there was one of my team who looked after the sort of public services elements and another member of my team who covered the economy and finance side and helped provide a focus for the other members of the special advisor team to be able to have somebody to contact.
Thank you. And you explain at paragraph 12 of your first witness statement that it is unusual in the Whitehall context for special advisors to stay in post for as long as you have been. And as we noted earlier, you've worked for 3 First Ministers and have been a special advisor for nearly 20 years. You also say that in the Welsh Government context, many of the teams of special advisors have years of experience of working with the civil service and in Welsh public life. In your view, to what extent did that longevity of service of special advisors affect the Welsh Government's decision-making?
It was not something I was particularly conscious of at the time, but having reflected on the experiences since, the fact that we had spent as long as we had understanding the ways in which government works, knowing the individuals with whom we relied heavily upon, certainly in the early months, and having relationships of trust with them was extraordinarily beneficial.
Thank you. And would it be fair to say that you had a very close working relationship with the First Minister?
Yes.
And would it also be fair to say that there were very few people who were quite as close to the centre of Welsh Government decision-making during the pandemic as you were?
Yes.
What was your relationship with your counterparts in the UK government and other devolved governments?
Until the pandemic, limited. I had very little contact with other special advisors. I had met my counterpart in the Scottish Government before Christmas in 2019, when the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales had done a joint press conference in relation to some Brexit-related activity. I had no real contact with the special advisors in the UK government until the pandemic began.
And when the pandemic did begin, how would you describe those relationships?
The relationships with the UK government special advisors were intermittent, but that's not the right word, were frequent in the beginning, in the early months, both with the special advisor in the Wales office and a special advisor in number 10. My relationship with them deteriorated over the first months of the pandemic, and I would guess that by the summer of 2020 we weren't really having any regular contact at all. My relationship with the special advisor to the First Minister of Scotland developed and has continued.
And when you say that your relationship with the UK government special advisors deteriorated. What do you attribute as the cause of that deterioration?
The tensions between the actions taken by the Welsh Government and the actions taken by the UK Government sort of became more and more obvious. And once we reached the point through the beginning of May, certainly, and I suspect this is a period we'll return to, and into the summer, the fact that the Welsh Government were taking decisions in a different way to the United Kingdom Government just meant that there was very little for us to talk about.
Thank you. And you're correct to say that we'll return to that period and the divergence between the governments later today. I want to turn now to your attendance at meetings during the pandemic. If we could please have on screen INQ 000227534. This is a document that you have provided which sets out the various meetings you attended as an observer. And it's fair to say, is it not, that save for a period between the end of November 2020 and sometime in February or March 2021, when you were largely absent for personal reasons, you attended almost every cabinet meeting, ministerial call, and meetings with the UK government and the other devolved governments that the First Minister attended.
I did.
And you also attended numerous internal Welsh Government meetings, again as an observer, is that right?
I did.
You say in your first witness statement that you did not provide any written briefings of these meetings, for these meetings. Is it right then that the advice you provided was mainly verbal throughout the entire period of the pandemic?
I will have contributed 2 papers that went to the meetings in internal Welsh Government civil service meetings. I would have had conversations with officials in the run-up to those papers being produced, but in terms of written advice for those meetings, that was not my role.
Thank you. I want to turn now to look at the Welsh Government's initial understanding of and response to Covid-19, and looking first at January and February 2020. In his witness statement to this module, the First Minister says that by the 24th of January 2020, he had been advised by Sir Frank Atherton that there was a significant risk that the virus would arrive in Wales. Do you recall whether the First Minister shared that information with you at the time?
I do not know.
The inquiry understands that Mr Drakeford attended his first COBRA meeting on the 18th of February 2020, and the Welsh Government was represented at earlier COBRA meetings by the Minister for Health and Social Services. Why did the First Minister not attend the first 3 COBRA meetings, notwithstanding those comments from his Chief Medical Officer?
The first couple of COBRA meetings, the invitations for the COBRA meetings will have come through to the First Minister's office. The First Minister would determine under other circumstances which minister was the most appropriate person to attend. And in the very early days, this was a matter that was being dealt with by the Health and Social Services team, and the Health Minister was the most appropriate person to attend.
Would you provide any advice to the First Minister on his attendance at meetings such as COBRA?
I would certainly have had conversations with him about that, yes.
And do you recall if you had conversations about those first 3 COBRA meetings?
No.
Covid-19 was not discussed by the Welsh Cabinet until the 25th of February. Again, in light of the advice from the Chief Medical Officer for Wales, did that surprise you?
No, there had been a number of written statements by the Minister for Health by this time, and the Minister for Health was keeping the First Minister updated informally, as was Dr. Frank Atherton.
Thank you. The First Minister said in his written evidence to Module 2 that looking back on matters and given what we know now, there is strong evidence to suggest that more stringent action could and should have been taken sooner, and that, for the record, is at paragraph 17 of INQ 000273747. Do you agree with Mr. Drakeford's assessment?
Yes.
Moving now to March 2020, I'd like to look at the Cabinet minutes from a meeting on the 4th of March 2020. This is at INQ 000048789. You are listed as an attendee there. There is a note at the top of these minutes that states, Cabinet will wish to note that these minutes, except those items in italics, will be published in the week commencing the 13th of April 2020. This is an instruction that appears on many Cabinet minutes, obviously with a different date of publication. Why is it that italicised items are not to be published?
Something you may need to ask the Cabinet Secretary, but I understand that there are items. This happens in relation to matters such as those when they're discussing finance and those where they're discussing matters that it would be inappropriate to be put into the public domain at such an early point in the publication. The Welsh Government has published minutes of Cabinet meetings for a very long time. It was one of the decisions taken by the First Minister I worked for.
Thank you. If we could turn to page 3 of this document, paragraph 2.6. The first sentence says, modelling by the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies suggested that under the reasonable worst case scenario, 80% of the population would be infected. And then the final sentence says, the same modelling suggested somewhere in the region of 25,000 deaths. Then looking at paragraph 2.7, this says, in terms of timescale, an increase in cases was expected over the coming weeks, with significant escalation in April and possibly intensification into May and June before the number of new infections started to drop. Just returning to what you said about italicised items being inappropriate to put in the public domain, in your view, why were these two items not published in the minutes that were published on the 13th of April 2020?
I'm afraid I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer this question. I was certainly aware of the figures set out in 2.6, and I distinctly remember the discussions around the reasonable worst case scenario at this point and the significance of them.
Thank you. And are you able to comment on whether this was the first time that the Cabinet was informed about the SAGE planning assumptions?
I don't know.
Thank you. You explain at paragraph 28 of your first witness statement that in around March 2020, there were an increasing number of meetings with the Cabinet, the Minister for Health and Social Services, the Chief Executive of the NHS, the CMO and others to discuss measures being taken specifically in the NHS in Wales, but also preparedness in other sectors. What was the level of your involvement in those meetings?
Sorry, what was the date you gave?
From March 2020.
Oh, okay. My involvement would have been to have sat and to have listened and to have picked up any action points that were appropriate for me to do.
Thank you. You attended a Covid-19 core group meeting on the 11th of March 2020. The minutes of that meeting are at INQ 000215171. And again, at the top it states that those minutes are not for publication. Are you able to comment on why that's the case?
No.
There is a discussion here about various topics, including whether to cancel routine hospital and GP appointments and the policy on mass gatherings. And there are a number of questions raised. At paragraph 12, the minutes note that ministers agreed that there was a need to address the questions that had been raised as soon as possible. Why were these questions not addressed in the meeting itself?
I suspect that the minute refers to the fact that there was action that would need to be taken following the meeting rather than in the meeting itself.
Thank you. I want to turn now to INQ 000303227. This is a WhatsApp group entitled AG Quintet, which includes Shan Morgan, Andrew Goodall, Andrew Slade and Tracy Burke. If we turn to page 4, at the bottom of the page, Dame Shan says as follows on the 17th of March 2020. Thanks all for an excellent CovExco. Saw Jane R afterwards. She's concerned about new Cobra ministerial structures and lack of DAs. In her oral evidence to the inquiry earlier this week, Dame Shan stated that she thought that you and the First Minister were concerned about the predictability of communications and engagement structures with the UK government. Is that an accurate summary of your concerns?
It is.
And why did you think that?
By this point, there was no real notice of when the Cobra meetings were going to happen, what the agendas for those meetings would be until very close, sometimes 10, 15 minutes before the meetings began. And the First Minister was becoming concerned about the levels of engagement that he felt were necessary due to the urgency of the situation we were in.
That is a point to which we will return later in your evidence. I want to turn to look in further detail at the degree of coordination between the Welsh Government and the UK Government. You explain in your statement at paragraph 38 that the potential for divergence between the 4 parts of the United Kingdom was referred to by the First Minister at Cobra on the 9th of March 2020, and this possible divergence was already evident by the Scottish Government's indication at Cobra that on the 12th of March 2020 that it intended to ban gatherings of more than 500 people. What was your advice to the First Minister in March 2020 as to the adoption of a 4 nations approach to a lockdown?
It was absolutely clear, as he was, that the 4 nations approach was the preferable way for us to be responding to the emerging situation.
And why was that?
Obvious point, the United Kingdom's an island,
Well, 3 parts of it are.
It's an absolutely fair point. I apologise to Northern Ireland for my slip up. And also, I think that the most important point was that we didn't, at that point, in any way, shape or form, anticipate that we would be in a situation where we would end up taking the kind of decisions that we did under the 1984 Act.
At paragraph 54 of your first witness statement, you say that it was becoming clear towards the end of April 2020 that divergence from the UK government decision-making might be necessary. And you say that a number of things had happened that put pressure on the relationship, including the opening of a test centre in Cardiff City Football Stadium by the UK government without any consultation with the Welsh government. And you say that that created significant difficulties with data. I want to just look at that specific example of the test centre in the Cardiff City Football Stadium, if we could have on screen INQ 000216485. And this is an email chain between Dr. John Bolton of Public Health Wales and other public health officials. Given you're not included as a recipient in this chain, I won't go into it in too much detail, but I just want to ask you about a couple of points. Dr. Bolton sets out the background to the setup of the testing facility, and under the heading Situation, he says that he was contacted on the 30th of March to arrange a call to discuss the UK-wide key worker testing strategy, and that contact was from Deloitte Consulting. And then he goes on to say that a call took place on the 1st of April 2020 at 3 p.m, in which he was told that they had set up a testing facility in Cardiff City Stadium and were ready to accept key workers for testing the following day. And then Mr. Bolton says, I asked them to stand down the facility until further discussion and clarity had been sought. He goes on to say, under background, that it doesn't appear that any communication to Public Health Wales or the Welsh Government had taken place prior to this call. Nobody in Wales knew it was coming, it appears. Knew they were coming, it appears. What was the reaction of this decision by the First Minister and other ministers for whom you advised?
They were very shocked and dismayed, really, that we were in a situation where a private company had opened a testing centre, that the way in which the NHS in Wales collects data hadn't been taken into account, and the fact that any of the responses or the positive tests that came through that test centre, as far as we could see, wouldn't be fed through into NHS records and into the data collection that we were responsible for.
And did you ever receive any information as to why there had been no communications with Public Health Wales or the Welsh Government?
No.
You set out in considerable detail in your first witness statement the ways in which the UK government began to diverge from the devolved governments, including, for example, the UK government changing their messaging from stay at home to stay alert on the 10th of May 2020. And on this point, can we have on screen INQ 000222864? This is a note that you prepared for the First Minister on the 4th of May 2020, is that right?
Yes.
And before we go into the contents of the note, how often would you produce documents like this for the First Minister?
Very rarely. I have 2 examples during the period the inquiry is covering.
Thank you. If we could turn to page 2, you set out there what you think that the First Minister's schedule might look like for the week ahead. And you say, avoiding as much as I can the dreaded supposition I was so rude about earlier. Could you explain what you mean by that?
There are a number of things in here that are bracketed later on in relation to Wednesday and Thursday, where we are making suppositions about what might happen in relation to engagement with the Welsh Government. We, at the point I wrote the note, which was Monday, I think, the 4th, were unclear as to what that engagement would look like for the rest of the week.
And so we can take it to mean that the Welsh Government were not being told when COBRA meetings might happen, is that right?
Yes.
And we'll come back to look at COBRA meetings in a moment. You then state later in your document that the UK government announcement on on continuation of current restrictions against supposition, with further announcement to follow on Sunday. And then further down the page, you say, questions from the comms side is going to be, do we go hell for leather on our plans on Thursday, Friday, ahead of UK government? Or do we do something on Sunday, again ahead of UK government? Or do we go for Monday after UK government? Could you explain why these were the options that you were proposing to the First Minister?
So I don't know that these are necessarily the options I personally was proposing. I think it's clear that it was a conversation that was being had beyond me. But the important point really is the 21-day review period was due to finish on the Thursday, which would have been the date that the decisions, Cabinet would have been taking the decisions. And so the decision was around, in this case, is around whether or not the First Minister does the announcement as close to the decision-making point as possible, or whether he holds back the announcement of that decision so that the UK government has gone and made the announcements they were going to make first.
And this is, as you say in the note, a question from the comms side. The inquiry will be hearing from Toby Mason later today, but please could you give your view on the extent to which the Welsh Government's communication and public health messaging from this point onwards diverge from that of the UK Government?
This is a very key period in this context from my point of view. A number of things. I think I refer in the first couple of paragraphs of the note to the fact that we had only really become aware in the days before this period that Sage was considering a series of questions from the Cabinet Office, from the UK Government, in relation to how to move out of restrictions, and asked Sage to do a series of modelling around some exact scenarios. And these scenarios were very England focused. And it was difficult for us to make assessments, similar assessments at that point on the basis of the information that they were being asked to provide because of the England focus. Sorry, I'm not sure I've answered your question.
No, that's a point that we will return to about the involvement of Sage in advising the Welsh Government.
It was about divergence, wasn't it? The reason it just is a very significant point at which it was becoming more and more apparent that the differences between the way in which the approach that we and the UK government were going to take was going to be necessary.
Thank you. And just returning to your note, further down the page, you then say, whatever we do, I think we can be more confident now that we aren't heading into a big collision course with them, certainly in the short term. And that is obviously a good thing for a number of reasons. We will need to retain the Welsh solutions to Welsh circumstances approach, particularly in relation to schools, where it feels very likely we will end up in a different place. Please could you just explain what you mean by this?
The First Minister was absolutely not looking for disagreements to be played out in a public arena as far as they possibly when they didn't need to be, and we were trying to avoid being in a situation where that was the case. In terms of the schools point, the information that Sage, and sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but the information that Sage had been asked to look at in relation to England, very heavily focused around the reopening of schools, and we were in a different place both with our relationship with local government and in the relationship with the teaching unions, and based on the scientific and the health advice that First Minister and the ministers were receiving about the sort of more gradual reopening, and the focus on schools was one aspect of that.
Thank you.
So to just follow that, so you, at this stage, you got the impression that the UK government were keener on reopening schools
Yes,
and the Welsh government was more cautious about reopening schools.
certainly that was what the evidence was suggesting to us that we should do.
And when you say the evidence, that evidence was medical, biomedical evidence, or did it include the various other harms that are caused by closing schools?
I'm not. So both were a consideration. I haven't reviewed the paperwork around this in any detail from memory. The balancing of the considerations that was going on at that point wasn't suggesting that there should be the impact of what would happen were schools to reopen at that point wasn't still fully understood. And so the advice that was being given to the First Minister and others was that we shouldn't be looking at that yet.
So really my question is, was the First Minister getting advice on the potential for harm for young people and children being denied access to schools, to social development, to education, to learning, all the rest of it?
My recollection was absolutely yes.
He was.
Yes.
I'd just like to pick up on that point. You say later in your witness statement, at paragraph 47F, that regarding the closure of schools and education settings, you facilitated discussions between officials, local authority leaders and support staff, and trade union representatives to ensure that they had an opportunity to discuss emerging evidence with scientific advisors and to ensure that ministers had feedback to inform future decisions. You don't mention here that you facilitated any discussions with children or parents. Do you recall whether their views were sought?
I know that certainly the Minister for Education and the First Minister engaged in a number of activities with children and young people. They had sessions of the Youth Parliament, specifically to hear views of young people, and a number of other fora I couldn't recollect the exact details of. My specific involvement in relation to the support staff trade unions was around a period where there were a number of concerns from the support staff trade unions particularly, and the support staff unions had felt and had been in contact with us that their views weren't being taken into account. So it was specifically the support staff trade unions rather than the kind of more conventional teaching trade unions I refer to.
Thank you. If we could turn now to INQ 000222865. This is a briefing note that you wrote to the First Minister on the 9th of June 2020, is that right?
Yes.
You say about halfway down the first page, if we therefore have some money in the bank to introduce further relaxations, how are we making these judgments? I know that there are a number of impact assessments being done, but fundamentally the balance of these things will come down, as it has at every other point in this process, to very fine judgments. Please could you explain how you were providing advice on those very fine judgments?
I'm not sure that I was specifically providing advice on those very fine judgments. I think this note just sets out what some of those things are, and I think it's important for me to say that this note was a very short part of an extraordinarily large number of other documents that the First Minister would have considered at this time.
Thank you. And then a little further down the page, you say, there are also some significant dates that we have been talking about, including the question as to whether we change from 21 days to 28. Personally, I really don't think it matters. We are not going to be able to easily align with the UK government, and to that end, all we are really buying are a couple of days for officials to try and pretend we will be better prepared. What did you mean at the end when you say try and be better prepared?
everything at this point, this is another significant and very difficult moment in what the decisions that First Minister and the Welsh ministers were trying to take. Coming out of the lockdown in some ways was an extraordinarily difficult set of circumstances. There wasn't a blueprint for how this was done, and there were an extraordinarily difficult number of issues and balances that needed to be considered. If you ask me whether or not we were prepared, I would have to say no. This hadn't been done before.
What is the reference, 21 days to 28?
The UK government moved from considering the regulations every 21 days to 28 days, and there was advice from the civil service to the First Minister that we should consider doing the same. He was very clear that he wanted to maintain the 21-day rhythm. It was something that the public were beginning to understand and recognise, and the structure that it provided him in terms of not only making the public announcement and the public understanding and being very clear about that, but also the series of meetings that happened in between, the cycle of meetings with officials, with external stakeholders, with the Social Partnership Council and others, was beginning to become understood and became a key feature of the way in which he communicated that with the public.
And finally, on the topic of divergence, you conclude in your first witness statement by saying that overall divergence between the decisions taken by Welsh ministers and the UK government and other parts of the United Kingdom was necessary for Welsh ministers to properly discharge their functions. And then you say Welsh ministers have a responsibility to discharge those functions on the basis of the advice that they receive. Can we take it from that final sentence that you were advising Welsh ministers to diverge from the UK approach?
No. I think what I was trying to say in that sentence was that once the decision to use the 1984 Act had been taken, that the Welsh ministers have statutory responsibilities in terms of the exercising of those functions, and that those functions needed to be undertaken based on the advice that they were provided by the civil service.
Thank you. I want to turn now to look at a point that we've briefly touched upon, which is the Welsh Government's involvement in COBRA meetings. At paragraph 40 of your first witness statement, you say that the control of the COBRA meetings and the production of papers for it rest exclusively in the hands of the UK Government. The First Minister did not see COBRA papers until very close to the time of the meetings, and it was often unclear what the agenda would be until just before the start of those meetings. How did this late circulation of COBRA papers that you describe affect your ability to advise the First Minister?
So it is not and would not have been the case that I would have been providing advice ahead of COBRA meetings or to the First Minister in relation to COBRA meetings, except possibly in relation to any of the kind of wider political considerations.
And do you have any views as to why those papers were provided at such short notice?
No.
If we could please turn to INQ 000222503. This is an email chain dated the 22nd of March 2020. And the first paragraph includes an action point for you, which states, emphasise to number 10 that we must have a predictable schedule for COBRA and its subgroups. Could you briefly explain, please, how this action point came about?
I believe that I called the special advisor at number 10, with whom I was already having conversations relatively regularly at this point.
The inquiry understands that in early April, the First Minister was pressing the UK government to convene a COBRA meeting in good time before the 16th of April, which was the date by which the first 21-day review needed to be carried out, so that the four nations could discuss a further set of coordinated announcements. Is that correct?
Yes.
So would it be fair to say that your attempts to secure a predictable schedule for those COBRA meetings fell on deaf ears?
They certainly weren't successful.
Turning back to your first witness statement, you say that the tensions that had emerged between the Welsh Government and the UK Government were very much evident in the run-up to this period, the Welsh firebreak, and I noted at a discussion on the 31st of October where I asked if there would be a COBRA meeting, and you noted how many times do we have to ask. Is it fair to say then that by October 2020, the Welsh Government was still not receiving adequate notice of COBRA meetings?
Yes.
During the pandemic, you made notes in a series of notebooks, is that right?
Yes.
And were the notes that you made a contemporaneous note, or were they made after the event?
They were contemporaneous.
Could we turn to one of those entries at INQ 000327611? And at page 2, this is dated at the top, the 31st of July 2020. And looking down the page, there's an entry timed 9:20 a.m. And you say phone call with Jack Stenner, Sadiq K. Is it correct that Mr. Stenner was special advisor to Sadiq Khan?
Yeah.
You record as follows: no straight data showing problems, but sense that things could change very, very quickly. What was that in reference to?
Was the date of this the 31st of July?
Yes.
I assume it will have been case levels, numbers of positive tests.
Thank you. And then just further down, you say no longer any contact with UK government, cut out completely. Again, what was that in reference to?
I believe that was Jack telling me that Sadiq's office had no longer had any contact with the UK government, that they had been cut out completely.
And how would you describe the contact between the Welsh Government and the UK Government at this time?
Sporadic. From a political point of view, I can't speak for what the contact with the between the civil servants was.
You say at paragraph 62 of your witness statement that discussions with the UK government moved towards conversations about issues such as how the joint biosecurity centre was going to work and how genuinely joint it was. Could you just explain what you mean by that?
When we first learnt of the creation of the joint biosecurity centre, I recall the First Minister having been given information about what its purpose was, and that there was genuine welcome for its creation. There were some concerns expressed about how joint in relation to the involvement of the devolved governments it would be. Largely these evaporated.
Thank you. And the inquiry understands that on the 3rd of June 2021, there was a meeting between the First Minister and the Prime Minister. You described this in your first witness statement as a summit, at which the Prime Minister committed to resetting the intergovernmental arrangements. You note in your witness statement that the First Minister told the Prime Minister that he believed that the fissures in the UK government were growing rather than contracting. Was that something that you discussed with the First Minister?
Yes.
And at this point, how would you describe the relationship between the First Minister and the then Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson?
Well, their contact was infrequent, and I believe the First Minister had a genuine sincerely held concern that some of the actions of the United Kingdom government in relation to the way they had handled some of the earlier period was a genuine threat to the future of the United Kingdom.
As we have touched upon, the First Minister was an advocate for a reliable and regular pattern of contact between all four nations during the pandemic. And we know that there were no joint ministerial committee plenary meetings at all during the pandemic. Is that right?
Yes.
And we also know that the principal point of contact was Michael Gove, initially in his capacity as Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster and later as Secretary of State for Levelling Up and the Constitution. And regular calls between Mr Gove and the First Ministers of the devolved administrations started in June 2020. Is that right?
Yes.
In your view, were these calls with Mr Gove a suitable substitute for a more codified set of arrangements?
No.
Why not?
They were an informal opportunity for the First Ministers and the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland to explore issues, but they were not areas in which there were not meetings where sort of significant decisions at a four nations basis were taken place.
Thank you. And did anything change as regards intergovernmental relations after that June 2021 summit?
No.
You say that they weren't meetings where significant decisions on a four nations basis could take place. But from what I've heard, given the different approaches in Scotland, as you said, Wales, and I may hear in Northern Ireland, is it likely that had those meetings been held, there would have been any four nations decisions taken on a four nations basis because people weren't agreeing?
I do think there's a period in the run-up to the firebreak and post that period in the run-up to Christmas where there was a significant effort to try and realign the decisions that had been taken previously. And I certainly believe in the case of the First Minister for whom I work that he would have at earlier stages liked that to be the case.
I think my question really is, that may well be in a perfect world, but given we're not in a perfect world, had those meetings taken place, Prime Minister and First Ministers and Deputy First Minister, would it have made any difference? Because they weren't going to agree, were they?
Is there an alternative universe where this was possible? I think there probably is.
Beyond my terms of reference, I think.
I want to turn now to a point that you've already touched upon, which is your role in relation to medical and scientific expertise. And whilst, of course, you did not personally provide medical and scientific advice, a key part of your role, as you say in your witness statement, was to listen and, when points required escalation to ministers, to consider both the speed of that escalation and whether escalation was needed outside of the formal meeting structures that were in place. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
And presumably we're talking there about advice from the Welsh Government or Welsh bodies such as Public Health Wales. Is that right?
Yes, my contact with Public Health Wales was limited. I don't recall whether by this point the HPAG subgroup had been created, which was one of the ways in which I did have more regular contact with officials from Public Health Wales. I guess in the context I was referring to Dr. Frank Atherton and the Chief Scientific Officers for Health, Advisors for Health.
Thank you. There was a point in May 2020 when the First Minister wrote to Sir Patrick Vallance as chair of SAGE, outlining the desire of the Welsh Government to engage more actively in the work that SAGE was undertaking. And if we could just pull up that letter, which is INQ 000299310, it's dated the 26th of May. In your view, and this is a point that you've already touched upon, but in relation to this letter specifically, why was it necessary for the First Minister to write to Sir Patrick in this way?
I did refer to this briefly earlier. It was very noticeable to us towards the end of April and into the beginning of May that some of the work that was being undertaken by SAGE, and I'm sure there was other work beyond this, but some of the work that was being undertaken by SAGE on modelling in relation to easements from the lockdown was being undertaken based on a set of questions that were being asked to them by the UK Government Cabinet Office, which reflected very specific England-focused questions, something that I think Nicola Sturgeon raises in a meeting with the UK government. I think it's around this time where she discussed the different term dates in Scotland being a particular consideration, but it was those kinds of issues that we were concerned about.
Thank you. I want to take you now to a WhatsApp chain, which is at INQ 000303220. This is from a group titled Drake Spads and includes various people, including yourself. Is it fair to assume that the group was what it says on the tin? It was the First Minister's special advisors?
It is.
If we turn to page 11 and about halfway down the page, Tom Woodward says as follows: is it just me, or do we as a government need more scientists? Are we looking to recruit more? In England, even the departments have their own scientists, while it feels like we all have to bother the same 3 people for everything, and I feel rather guilty about it. Obviously not sustainable if this continues for years. And just pausing there, the 3 people referred to, are they Dr. Atherton as Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Orford as Chief Scientific Advisor, and Fliss Benet, Co-Chair of TAG and Deputy Director for Digital Data and Technology?
I would assume so, yes.
The next message in the chat is an hour and a half later and relates to a separate meeting. Why was Mr. Woodward's point here about the need for more scientists not addressed?
As I'm sure we'll come on to, this was a very informal conversation, and I'm not sure that Tom was looking for an answer or that I was qualified to give him one.
And what is your view of Mr. Woodward's point that more scientists in the government were needed?
I suspect that the point that Tom was making, where are we, 22nd of June, related to the fact that we had at this point an enormous number of meetings taking place both internally and with external stakeholders, and we relied very heavily on the 3 of those three people to attend those meetings and to explain the evidence that they were hearing.
Thank you. I want to turn now to look at the methods of communication that you used to conduct government business during the pandemic. You say in your second witness statement that from the 1st of January 2020 to the 31st of May 2022, you used your personal mobile phone to send WhatsApp messages. Is that right?
It is.
And you explained that there were 3 groups that were routinely used. A minister's WhatsApp group, is that the Drake Spads that we have just looked at?
No.
Separate. Forgive me. A special advisor WhatsApp group, which is the Drake Spads WhatsApp group, and a group with a small team of Welsh Government lawyers.
Yes.
And is that final group the coronavirus legal hotline group?
Yes.
There are a number of Welsh Government policies and documents that were in place dealing with the use of informal communications, including text messages and WhatsApp. And the inquiry heard evidence from Dame Sian Morgan about many of those policies. I won't go into detail about them, but I just want to take you to two and ask you about two aspects of your use of your personal mobile phone and WhatsApp. If I could take you first to a document from January 2020, which is a CSIRO notice, Senior Information Risk Owner. And this is at INQ 000396686. And on page 3, under the heading WhatsApp, it states, in the same way that personal email accounts cannot be used to undertake government business, Welsh Government business, personal WhatsApp accounts may not be used for Welsh Government business. Were you aware that conducting Welsh Government business through a personal WhatsApp account was prohibited?
So I think there's two things to say. The first one is I have asked the civil service to confirm that I received this notice because I did not recognise it when it was provided to me by the inquiry, and I have had confirmation that I was not on the distribution list to be sent this email. However, I do recognise that I knew that I was not in a position to use my personal phone for Welsh Government formal decision making, and I do not believe that that was the case. The groups that I've discussed were used for admin purposes and for team morale. This was a point at which my team was no longer in the office, and it was something that we did use to keep in contact and to keep the team together.
We will return in a moment to a...
Before you move on, if I may, Ms Hitchman, but isn't using your personal phone for admin purposes using it for Welsh Government business?
Yes.
So you were using it wrongly?
Yes.
Thank you, my lady. We'll return in a moment, Ms Runnacles, to a couple of examples in those WhatsApp groups. But I just want to look first at another document which relates to the preservation of conversations for record-keeping purposes. And that's at INQ 396685. And this is the Welsh Government Information Management and Governance Policy, published in August 2018. And on page 17, at paragraph 6.6, it states at the top there, text or instant messages are electronic mail and messaging systems used for the purpose of communication between individuals. Staff should be aware that when using their Welsh Government phones in this way, they are in fact creating public records. Staff using private phones for Welsh Government business may also be creating public records. The ephemeral nature of text messages and instant messaging heightens the need for users to be aware that they may be creating records using this application and to properly manage and preserve record content. Were you aware of this policy?
Yes. I don't know that I was sent this document in the same way, but it would be wrong of me to assume that I wasn't aware of the general points.
Thank you. I want to turn now to a few examples of your use of WhatsApp during the pandemic. If we could turn to the ministerial WhatsApp group, that's at INQ 000303219. And is it right that this group includes UN ministers, including Kirsty Williams, Rebecca Evans, Julie James, and others?
Yes.
And if we can turn to the final page, page 73. On the 25th of November 2021, you turned on disappearing messages. And the consequence of that was that messages in the chat would disappear 7 days after they were sent, except where they were kept. In her evidence to this module, Dame Sian Morgan expressed her surprise that you turned on disappearing messages, notwithstanding the guidance that we have just discussed. In light of that guidance and your acceptance that you were aware of the requirement to preserve records, why did you turn on disappearing messages?
Melody, I think this is something I've reflected on a lot. And I think it would be very useful for people who hold the kind of role that I hold in the future for there to be some clear recommendations about this. I do not believe that there is any evidence of decision making in any of these groups, and I think that in areas where we were using this tool, and possibly I should have been using Teams and creating a chat function on Teams, which was the method that the Welsh Government does recommend. I wasn't sure I knew how in March 2020, but and the Welsh Government record keeping in that regard requires that those messages are deleted after 30 days. The 2009 document that I also have part of my evidence pack makes it clear in relation to telephone conversations that ministers have records of telephone conversations between ministers and don't need to have formal records kept when they're looking at policy development or in relation to responding to events that happen quickly. And I think that there is a distinction in my mind between the formal records and the decision-making processes that ministers undertook and this kind of communication, but I'm aware that there is a lot of interest in this topic.
Well, in the hearings for 2A in Scotland, I think it was agreed by some of the witnesses that it's not just decision-making that should be recorded, and that's really what the document to which Ms Hitchman just took you indicates, that it goes beyond decision-making. And the importance of keeping records, as I'm sure you appreciate, is not just for the purposes of an inquiry of this kind, but for public accountability.
I obviously understand the need to take this in terms of future activity.
You just mentioned in your response the 2009 document. I think you are referring to the guidance on private office records. That's at INQ 000396684. If we could just pull that up briefly. And at paragraph 5 at the bottom of the page, it says that the records of special advisors require separate consideration where special advisors have a wider role in the department and have an impact on official business. The records originated by a special advisor should be retained by the department, save where it goes on to say their records only mirror those existing elsewhere. So would you accept that even in your role as a special advisor, you had an obligation to record conversations via WhatsApp?
I would have interpreted the important part of this as being where they had an impact on official business.
Thank you. I want to take you to one more WhatsApp conversation, which is the coronavirus legal hotline. That's at INQ 000331038. And this WhatsApp group includes you, other special advisors, and
There's no other special advisors on this group, I heard that said yesterday. It's only me.
forgive me. So this includes you and Welsh Government lawyers.
Yeah.
If we could turn to page 90. And at page 90, 90, forgive me. There's an extract here where Helen Lentil says, this is the 17th of September 2020, have Rob O, presumably that's a reference to Rob Orford, revealed his big news yet? You say, you respond with a question mark. Dylan Hughes says, the important information from Sage. Helen Lentil responds, that's what Fliss, and presumably that's a reference to Fliss Benet, who we've already discussed, said to them, said then, lockdown, and you respond, Fliss just said they recommend a short national lockdown. We are all ignoring her. What did you mean by that?
I don't recall.
And why were you having a conversation about something as important as another national lockdown on WhatsApp rather than via official government channels?
My notebook on the 18th of September records a conversation I had with Fliss specifically on this point. And there are a considerable number of official records of meetings that happen in the subsequent days and weeks on this point. I don't believe that we were not taking this seriously.
And if we turn to the final page of this chat, disappearing messages are turned on the 15th of June 2021. That wasn't by you, but by another member of the chat. Do you know why disappearing messages were turned on this legal advice chat?
No.
I just have a couple more questions for you, Ms. Runnicles. At paragraph 35 of your statement, you state that you were involved in discussions with the Education Minister, leading to the decision on the 18th of March 2020 that schools would close early for the Easter holidays. And there's also a ministerial advice dated the 20th of March 2020. And we won't pull it up, but for the record, that's INQ 000145342, which sets out the advice to the Minister on this point. Focusing on this period alone, would you agree that the discussion and decision was based perhaps understandably on infection control, but that in doing so there was no consideration or discussion of the impacts of the Rights of the Children measure 2011 or the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child?
I don't think it would be fair to say there was no consideration, and there were certainly discussions about the impact on children of the decision that the Minister for Education took.
And would you agree that there was no discussion involving or consulting the Children's Commissioner for Wales?
At that point, no.
And would you agree that there was no discussion of the mitigation measures or support children may need at home if they were required to remain at home for a long term?
Would I agree that there was no consideration?
There was no discussion or consideration of those mitigation measures?
There absolutely was.
Thank you, Ms. Runnicles. My lady, I have no further questions.
Thank you. Seven, I think you have a question.
Good morning, Ms. Runnicles. I represent the Covid-19 bereaved Family to Justice Cymru. Just one very short topic, and it's divergence and justification. Just to indicate we don't need to get the statement up. So you state at paragraph 60 of your witness statement that the 11th of May 2020 was the point at which Wales and the UK government began to diverge in pace and messaging. So it was around this time, that's what you indicate. Now, a narrative has been presented to this inquiry in the witness statements, generally from the Welsh Government, that the Welsh Government was more cautious following the first lockdown, and it was more cautious and took a more gradual approach to reopening of society as compared to the UK government. And this has been presented as one of the justifications for not taking a four nations approach. Now, on divergence, we obviously know that on the 11th of May in England, the UK government and Chris Whitty recommended that the public wear face coverings where social distancing wasn't possible. But on the 12th of May, Frank Atherton advised that face coverings was a matter of personal choice, and he actually told the public that. So do you agree that it isn't entirely accurate, and I'm not suggesting you're doing this, but it is from generally the statements, to categorise the Welsh Government as always cautious in that first easing of the lockdown, of the first lockdown, as compared to the UK Government being perhaps less cautious? Because clearly if we look at the approach on public messaging and face coverings in May, it's right, isn't it, that we can see the Welsh Government taking perhaps a less cautious approach than the UK Government, who are being a bit more precautionary. So do you agree on that topic? Certainly it isn't right to suggest that the Welsh Government were always more cautious, and I'm talking about that May period.
I don't know that I have suggested that we were more cautious in the way that you describe, have I?
No, I'm not saying that necessarily you do. I mean, you indicate in your statement that in May there was a change in pace. That's when you saw the divergences beginning. But it is being suggested generally, thinking particularly the statement by First Minister of Wales, Mr Drakeford, that Wales was more cautious following that first lockdown. So I'm just asking you whether you agree that on the topic of face coverings, it would seem that the UK Government was more cautious than the Welsh Government at this time.
We certainly took a different position to the UK Government in relation to face coverings.
OK, that's fair enough. Well, thank you very much. That's my question, lady.
Thank you. I just have one question I'd forgotten. I'm sorry to take you back to the test centre, Ms Runnels. I understand the reaction if the Welsh Government had no idea that this test centre was being set up. I think that made that plain by my reaction yesterday. So I understand the reaction to the lack of notice and consultation. But given that you're informed by a private company that they've set up a test centre and it can be available the next day for key workers, why turn down that opportunity as opposed to saying, well, if you can provide us with the data, you mentioned you wouldn't get the data fed into the NHS. Wouldn't it be better to accept the offer of the testing centre with amendments?
That's what happened.
That is what happened?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Very well. I shall return at 25:02.
All rise.
My lady,
Yes,
may I please call Toby Mason?
Would you like to repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mason. Could you please begin by giving us your full name, please?
Yes, my full name is Toby Rees-Mason.
Thank you. Thank you for assisting the inquiry, both through the provision of your witness statement and for attending today. If I can please remind you, when answering questions, please keep your voice up and try and speak slowly so our stenographer is able to keep pace with your answers. Thank you. You have produced a witness statement for this module of the inquiry. That statement is at INQ 000340123. And that statement has been signed by you on the 2nd of November of 2023. Is this statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is.
Thank you. Mr Mason, you were appointed as Head of Strategic Communications for the Welsh Government in January of 2014. Is that right?
That's correct.
And to be clear, your role is not a political appointment, is it? You are, in fact, a civil servant.
That's correct. I'm a civil servant.
Thank you. Prior to your appointment as Head of Strategic Communications, you were news organiser in the BBC Wales political unit based in the Senedd in Cardiff Bay. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. So you were ultimately responsible for all aspects of the Welsh Government's external communications, and you were head of the profession for communications during the pandemic.
Correct.
In his statement to the inquiry, Dr. Andrew Goodall has summarised the structure of the communications team. And from this statement, the inquiry understands that the Central Communications Division had 4 components. These components were the Press Office, which provides press support for the First Minister, Counsel General and other governmental ministers, the Corporate Digital Team, which is responsible for the operation and content production of the Welsh Government's corporate digital channels, Cabinet Communications, which delivers major national events, and the Central Design Team, which provides services such as graphic design and typesetting. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Is it correct that as of approximately September 2022, there were about 144 posts within the Welsh Government, and only 2 of these posts were part of the communications profession, and these posts were either within the Central Communications Division or working to departmental heads of communication? Is that right?
There are 140 posts within the communications profession.
Yes, thank you. You explain in your witness statement that the Communication Division's principal role in the overall COVID response was to provide communications and handling advice to decision makers and to communicate those decisions as clearly as possible. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And in Dr. Goodall's statement, he states, the Welsh Government's approach to public health communications throughout the pandemic was governed by the principles of clarity, transparency, honesty, and giving people all the key information needed to keep themselves and their families safe at every stage. Do you agree with that characterisation?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask you about the role of the communications profession during the pandemic. In your witness statement, you explain that from the outset of the pandemic, ministers and senior officials within the Welsh Government recognised the importance of clear and consistent communications. You say in your statement that communications advice and guidance was provided as frequently as possible to inform policy and decision-making by both ministers and officials. Can I please ask, what form did this advice and guidance take?
It took a wide variety of forms. Every paper that went to Cabinet had a communication section within it that would be signed off along with the rest of the Cabinet paper. I would also provide more specific papers to Cabinet on particular aspects of communications handling. Our Keep Well Safe campaign, which we'll probably come on to later, every major kind of iteration of that and every change in messaging was communicated to Cabinet so that they understood the overall strategy that we had for the kind of communications approach. And then, of course, there was the more kind of informal communications handling advice to ministers, for example, briefings before press conferences.
Thank you. What sources was your advice based upon?
So we drew information from a wide variety of sources. Behavioural insights was important, and we had a representative on the RCBI, and you heard from Professor Anne John. So that was incredibly useful. We undertook extensive tracker polling during the pandemic, which gave us insight into people's level of trust in the Welsh Government, people's understanding and compliance with the rules at any given time. But we also undertook focus groups, and they were really important for us in gauging people's sentiment towards their safety, towards the government actions. And they enabled us, I think, to put together quite a broad set of advice that ministers could then consider as part of their decision-making process.
Thank you. You also explained in your witness statement that your team worked closely with the Public Health Wales communications team, given their responsibility for public health information provision. Could you please describe your relationship with the Public Health Wales communications team in a little more detail?
Yes, of course. Public Health Wales, at the very outset of the pandemic, the Four Nations pandemic communication plan was triggered, and it was very clear that Public Health Wales at that point were the lead in informing the public on.
I'm just going to interject, Mr. Minson. I don't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you to slow down a little bit? I can feel that your pace is picking up a bit. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were talking about the Four Nations communications plan.
So Public Health Wales, along with the health communications section of the Welsh Government, worked effectively as one team in the early stages of the pandemic in order to provide public health advice to people in Wales. That was done on a very much a Four Nations basis. As the pandemic progressed and as the Welsh Government began to put in place its own rules and regulations, then obviously the role of government communications and ministerial communications began to increase dramatically. But Public Health Wales were always a very important component of our overall strategy because they had the clinical expertise. And as we know, during a pandemic, it's really important to have those trusted clinical, non-political voices to the public as well. So they were really important.
Thank you. How regularly did you provide advice to Welsh ministers, would you say?
As I said in my earlier answer, every cabinet paper would have a communications section. Some obviously were more relevant than others, but I mean on a kind of informal basis, on a kind of daily basis, when we as the communications leads interacted with ministers, that's the advice we would provide. But there were more formal touch points too.
Thank you. In your witness statement, you say that as well as attending Cabinet, you attended meetings of the ex-COVID group, the Health Protection Advisory Group, and other senior meetings within the government structure. Do you think you had sufficient involvement in key meetings and groups during the pandemic?
I can say I absolutely did. The importance of communication as one of the key components of the government's response was absolutely recognised by the First Minister, by ministers, by successive permanent secretaries and by senior officials. I think it was really important that we had a seat at the table at those meetings. You'll see from the minutes that I contributed. And one of the things I think we were able to do was bring a degree of external perspective to those discussions through feeding in the focus group results, the social listening activities that we did as well. And I felt that was that was a very important part of my.
Thank you. We will talk about some of those later on, but thank you. At paragraph 48 of your witness statement, you say that there was initially no dedicated budget for communications. Are you able to say why that was?
So the way at that point communications budgeting worked across the government is that each policy area, when they were undertaking communications, for example, climate change communications, the communications budget would come out of that to pay for that activity. So as we went into the pandemic, what effectively happened was that the health communications team, who looked after initially the Stay Home, Save Lives aspect of the campaign that was run jointly with the UK government, would have budget in order to promote that in Wales alongside the UK government. But then we've spoken obviously about divergence. In May 2020, the budgets for the distinctively Welsh Keep Well Safe campaign ramped up dramatically and I think reached £12 million in 2021, I understand, which is a very substantial amount of money for us.
Thank you. To the extent that you haven't already answered this question, can you say what impact did the initial lack of budget for communications have on the effectiveness of the communication strategy employed?
I would say that in the early stages, given the Four Nations approach, the buying power of the UK government across the UK meant that we were playing to some extent a kind of supporting and helping role in terms of, for example, making sure that material in Wales was bilingual. The ramping up of budgets that I talked about happened pretty rapidly once the divergence happened.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to look at the approach taken by your team to communications with vulnerable and at-risk groups and those who were digitally excluded. Before we start, can you please summarise what is meant by digitally excluded?
Yes, this is a group of the population who either don't have access to internet, social media, or struggle to kind of navigate that. And there's pretty robust data on that group.
Thank you. Are you able to say what proportion of the Welsh population would be considered to be digitally excluded?
And this is from recollection, but I think we are looking at around about a third of the over 75s. But that just gives a kind of indication.
Thank you. You explain in your witness statement that advice and evidence on the direct impact of NPIs on particular groups was principally a matter for colleagues in policy and science areas, and subsequent consideration by Cabinet on the balancing of relative harms. You note, however, that the at-risk and vulnerable groups who may have been digitally excluded were an important and distinct audience for our communications, which sought to reach groups such as these through the channels most accessible to them. Please, can you explain how you sought to reach these groups? And can you please be mindful when answering this question of efforts made to include older people in your strategy? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I'll give three very, very brief examples, if I may, of the breadth of the communications work that we did. So children and young people were really important. They don't necessarily consume news in the way that maybe adults do. And for that, we made quite extensive use of TikTok, which was not a channel that we'd used as a government much at all, but that's where a lot of attention was. So we would actually take on influencers to carry our public health messages to that group. We also had, and I referred to this in my statement, community teams who were on the ground in multi-ethnic, multicultural communities, speaking directly to people, because one of the insights that we had was that sometimes government is not necessarily the right conduit for government messages. And then the third aspect, and this goes to the points that we were making, we printed leaflets. We were pretty old-fashioned. We simplified the messages as much as possible, and this was something that the Minister for Social Justice, in particular, was very, very held our feet to the fire. So those leaflets were distributed through all our kind of networks of contacts to GP surgeries, to community centres, but we also undertook all Wales door drops. So we were reaching 1.4 million households. I hope that gives you kind of a breadth of if we were able to reach people via channel, we would use it. I just want to say one very brief thing: the importance of the daily press conferences.
Yes.
They were a game changer for us, and the decision of BBC Wales to televise those really, I think, made a huge difference, because we were able to reach then people who may have been digitally excluded.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. By door drops, do you mean sticking them through people's letterboxes?
Yes, you effectively contract Royal Mail to deliver one to every household in Wales.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to remind you again, just to keep your voice low, and I'm sorry to keep reminding you, but please bear that in mind. You've touched on this in your answer, actually, to the previous question, but you do note in your witness statement that there was emerging evidence of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and so particular effort was made to engage with these audiences. Can you describe anything further that you may have done subsequent to what you described in your early answer regarding steps taken by your department to engage with these audiences?
Yes, absolutely. We partnered with a lot of organisations who had particular insight into these communities. We took on a specialist consultancy at one point, really to kind of hone how we were doing. I think the work of the COVID-19 Race Advisory Board, chaired by Professor Bonner, was really useful and was a very useful challenge to us. And I think one of the main things we did was work with community leaders. As I said, a trusted conduit for our messages.
Overall, in your view, to what extent did the Welsh Government adequately engage with at-risk and minoritised groups?
I believe we did. You can always do better, and there were learnings for us throughout the pandemic. But I think, as you can see from the statement and the documents that I've exhibited, we did. I feel as much as we could.
Thank you.
If you're moving on, when you say you could have done better with hindsight, what might you have done better?
I think that deep kind of community engagement, we could have expanded potentially those street teams. They were in a number of areas during the pandemic. I think I think that would be the main thing, and just how important that was in terms of particularly around the vaccination programme.
Thank you. There's no mention of any particular efforts made by your team to reach disabled communities in your statement. Are you able to express a view on why that might be, given that disabled people face significant barriers to accessing information during the pandemic and also faced significant digital exclusion?
Yes, that is an omission, I think. We, as with all kind of groups, they were really important. We had the shielding cohort, the shielding group of people. They were written to directly by the chief medical officer on a number of times during the pandemic, and we, during the press conferences, the First Minister and others would address that kind of group directly. But we were focused on getting the broadest set of messages out to the broadest number of people throughout the pandemic.
So just to be completely clear, when you say that was an omission, do you mean that's an omission from your statement rather than the strategy?
I think it's an omission from the statement. I think we were cognizant of that.
Thank you. I'm now going to ask about engagement across the four nations in terms of communications. You explain in your statement that using the devolved Public Health Act 1984 as the underpinning legislation for MPIs meant that there was always the potential for policy divergence between UK nations. And you say this made liaison between communications teams in each of the four nations particularly important. How did you ensure that your team had an effective relationship with the UK government and other devolved governments?
This was absolutely an absolutely vital part of my team's role in this. A lot has been spoken about the potential for confusion due to different rules in different parts of the UK. Very high, if not the top of our list, was to ensure that people in Wales understood the rules that applied to them and what the government's messages were. As I said, the early stages of the pandemic, in fact, up until, and it's been again rehearsed in front of the inquiry, mid-May 2020, there was we were in lockstep in communications terms as much as we were in policy terms. Maybe the tone of government communications was different, but it was very, very clear what the core underlying public health messages were. During that period, I think liaison and was constructive and worked well. The big issue came at the Cobra in mid-May.
Can I just pause you there?
Yes.
We may come to the Cobra meeting slightly later. I just want to be clear. You've emphasised the importance of effective liaison. Can I just ask, what did you do to ensure that your team had effective liaison at the relevant time?
No, absolutely. There was liaison at all levels of the communications teams throughout the pandemic. I had contact with the UK Government's Director of Communications. The health, our health communications teams were very closely involved with DHSC, Public Health England and the other devolved administrations. But the really critical point was once the divergence took place, we formalised a four nations communications group of senior leaders, myself, the head of the UK government's COVID communications hub and the other devolves. And that would be a really, really important learning from the pandemic to establish early. I cannot stress that enough.
Thank you. The inquiry understands from your statement that the formal engagement that you described was in fact a weekly meeting with the head of the Cabinet Office COVID Hub and other senior staff. The inquiry understands that minutes were not taken of these meetings. Is that right?
I don't have minutes of those meetings. It may be they were convened by Cabinet Office and the COVID Hub. They may have minutes of the meetings. My role was very much to kind of feedback almost in real time to colleagues working on Welsh Government communications and campaigns, what the latest thinking and direction of travel was in Whitehall.
Thank you. In your statement, you say that you do not recall any substantial changes to Welsh Government communication strategies as a result of these meetings, or any changes to the UK Government communication strategies as a result of their impact upon Wales. You've already explained that you think a key learning point would be to, in the event of a future crisis, set up this meeting again. So it's clear that you think it is of value. Can you please explain why you think this group was particularly beneficial?
Yeah, if I can just clarify on the strategies. What I'm talking about there is the kind of top level approach, communications approach. So we had a very distinctive approach in Wales. The UK government took a slightly different tone and approach in their communications. While it was useful to understand what was behind those, these meetings weren't about us telling them you should change your. There was none of that. Sorry, the question was in terms of...
It's what you think the benefit of. Sorry, what you think the benefit of this group was.
It was... I think there were just very quickly a number of things. Particularly once we got into 2021, there was really good or much better advanced sharing of UK government campaign materials that would run in Wales. So we were able to look at them and advise the UK government that if there were things in there that ran counter to the rules that were in place in Wales, that they could try at least and not run them in Wales. So that was a really important point. And there was quite an important kind of pastoral point as well. We were all, working under quite a degree of stress, and, it was incredibly useful and supportive to talk to colleagues who were in similar positions in the other governments of the UK.
Thank you. In your witness statement, you give the example of the Hands, Face, Space, Air campaign of March 2021 as illustrating the complexity of trying to get message alignment based on changing rules in each of the 4 nations. Can you please explain why this was such an instance of complexity?
I think, again, going back to that top line of hands, face, space, air are the key protective behaviours that people needed to adopt based on scientific and medical advice during the pandemic. We had no particular issue with UK government communications and campaigns running in Wales because as long as they were reinforcing the absolutely key behaviours that people needed to keep the prevalence of the virus down, that was a good thing. The problem was all the content that sat underneath there. So if you had images of, say, people gathering outdoors, and it was clearly more than 6 people gathering outdoors, the rule in Wales at that time might have been no more than 6 people can gather outdoors. So that was the work. And I have to say that Cabinet Office, civil service colleagues were really diligent in terms of trying to do that. But we were dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of content at any given time.
Thank you. If I can please now turn to document INQ 000282302,
Yeah.
I see you perhaps recognise this document.
This is exactly what we were just talking about.
Right, well, you may need to help me explain this.
Yes.
In your statement, you explained that this document was a spreadsheet that was circulated by the UK government relating to communications activities they planned to carry out. Can you recall when this spreadsheet was circulated?
Yes, this would have been, so that phase 1, 29th of March in column 3, column A, would have been, I think, 2021. And this is a really good example of the fact that after a year, we did get to a point where Cabinet Office and the UK government were very cognizant of the issues that were being caused by pieces of content giving the wrong impression to people in different nations. But this is a tiny part of an even bigger and more complicated spreadsheet that but I wanted to exhibit this just to illustrate the care that was taken perhaps in the latter stages of the pandemic.
Thank you. You explain in your witness statement that this spreadsheet was circulated and you or your office were asked to input changes that would need to be made to reflect the variations in rules across the 4 nations. If we can please look to lines 1 and 2 first, really. Moving across line 1, at column B and C, which have a yellow background, we can see that the cells are labelled Wales, with column B being a yes-no option and column C being headed dates. We can see moving across line 1 that these column headings are replicated for Scotland and Northern Ireland, and then there are further columns relating to UK-wide matters. Can we please look at line 26 of the spreadsheet, please? So at column A, we can see the phrase meeting up again. Is this row therefore about messaging relating to meeting up again?
Yes, this would have been, I think, a piece of content that was encouraging people as we came out of the more onerous restrictions to meet up safely.
Thank you. There's then more detail provided in column I of line 26. If we can just scan along to that, please. Now, still on the topic of meeting up again, column I states that in Scotland, things depend on a child's age. In Wales, it's noted yes, but it should be clear that there are 2 households. Also, change line, stick to groups of 6 from a maximum of 2 households. So can you just explain what meaning should be taken from this entry in the spreadsheet, please?
The meaning that should be taken from this entry is that that piece of content would have had the representation of a group of people, probably given it's around meeting up. What we were effectively saying to the UK government was, if this piece of content is to run in Wales, this is these are the rules that it needs to clearly depict to avoid confusing people.
Thank you.
But if you take a UK campaign, make it specific to Wales, which I understand the importance to the people of Wales, but then does it have relevance to England?
So without going too deeply into kind of media buying, so for example, with digital campaigns, you can have a number of different meeting up again pieces of content, and they can be sold into, that one piece could be sold into Welsh facing.
So you can tweak it to fit your different audiences.
You could, and then that one would be sold into media that people in Wales might see, Wales Online, ITV Wales, and it could be differentiated. One of the big problems I have, if I can just make this point, the problem was that the UK government, obviously the scale of what they were doing in terms of their media buying, their budgets was huge. If you buy a cover wrap for the Times newspaper, so the all-encompassing, there is no Welsh edition of the Times. That is sold in Cardiff in the same way that it's sold in London.
So you get the same cover wrap.
Which would refer to English.
Yeah, I follow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your explanation of this line on the spreadsheet. We've now looked at one line out of the 29 lines that are on the spreadsheet. Now, I appreciate some of the heading ones are column headings, but there are 29 lines. Each line reflects a topic about which public communication was anticipated. Would it be fair to say that at this point, the policies across the four nations were so different that clear communications to the public were becoming increasingly difficult?
There certainly were differences, as you can say. Some of them were sequencing differences, some were more substantive. I think, and the focus group data and the polling data do, I think, bear this out, that from a reasonably early period after May 2020, people in Wales became quite attuned, in fact, very attuned, I think, to the fact that the rules that they were being asked to follow may differ. And I think that was the overwhelming kind of imperative that we had in our communications, was just to illustrate those as clearly as possible. I do come back to the press conferences. They were absolutely vital. The First Minister always made it clear that if people tuned in at 12:30 every day, they would hear from the Welsh Government on the key messages, the progress of the virus, and any changes to Wales would be announced by the First Minister, not by ministers in London.
Thank you. You explain in your witness statement that there were occasions during the pandemic where communications and campaign materials from the UK government were published in Wales against the wishes of Welsh ministers. And you cite the introduction of the Stay Alert messaging, which was introduced in England in May of 2020 as an example of this. You state that at this point, the UK government's media buying strategy was UK-wide. And you state that it's your recollection that both the First Minister and the First Minister of Scotland expressed opposition to the Stay Alert messaging at the COBRA meeting, which took place on the afternoon of the 10th of May of 2020, and expressed the view that campaign material featuring this should not be run by the UK government in either Scotland or Wales, given the key message in those nations at that point was to stay home.
Correct.
You state that you were not given advance notice of the Stay Alert campaign prior to its introduction in England, and that your recollection was that the first you were aware of this campaign was when you saw it in the Sunday Telegraph on the morning of Sunday the 10th of May, which was the day of the COBRA meeting itself. Can we please bring up document INQ 000281683, please? This is an email dated the 5th of May of 2020, which you sent to various officials in the Welsh Government. And in this email, you summarise a conversation you had with the Director of UK Government Communications.
Yes.
At the 5th paragraph of the email, you state, it's pretty clear that after Thursday/Sunday, that from the UK Government side, Stay Home Save Lives has gone, all marking collateral will be removed. The question is what it is replaced with. Could be something as simple as stay safe as a strapline, with a series of subheadings around the measures that people and businesses can take. And you note that that's not verbatim, but that's an indication. Is it your recollection that the Stay Alert campaign was not discussed in detail in this conversation with the Director of the UK Government Communications team?
Yes, just to be clear that this was the Tuesday of the week that ended with the COBRA on the Sunday, just to give a sense of where we are with this. It's my sense that actually that the UK government had not, by this stage, settled on what their kind of campaign approach. So I wouldn't say there was an attempt not to tell me. What you see in this email is, I think, pennies dropping in Wales and in the UK government, that the theoretical potential for divergence is about to become real. And you touched on this with Jane Runnacles earlier on. So my response to this was obviously to make sure that there was a clear record of this conversation. But then what we did was accelerate the development of our own Keep Well Safe brand, Stay Home, Save Lives, Protect the NHS, was going to be withdrawn. So this was the kind of impetus for that. On the point about Stay Alert, yes, I recall conversations very early on that Sunday morning as we saw the Sunday Telegraph, and it was a kind of, oh, that's what they're going with. It was then included in the papers for the Cobra meeting that we received a couple of hours before on Sunday. Neither the First Minister of Wales nor the First Minister of Scotland were content with that. That led to comms colleagues in the UK government having to unpick very rapidly, sorry to use media buying again, but their media buying strategy. But that was also the reason I think that the Four Nations Directors of Comms Group was set up, was in order to try and avoid that crunch that happened on Sunday's Cobra.
Thank you. Now, there might be an issue as to whether formal notice of the proposed policy change was given. But even if notice was not given, do you think the Welsh Government could have been more proactive in liaising with the UK Government to agree a communication strategy around this policy change?
Well, as you can see, we were discussing it at very kind of senior levels. It may not be in this email, but I think it might be on the next page of the email that there was an action from the GPS. Yes. If I can read, yes. For awareness, this is an action from yesterday's GPS MIG, which may have prompted the call. Home Office and their counterparts in devolved administrations to ensure there is clear public communication of potential differences following Thursday's review. And yes. that was the process. But I think, policy was being decided very close to the wire. Equally, kind of communications followed that as well.
You may have answered this already, but just to cover the point, would you agree that the Welsh Government bears some responsibility for confusion around public messaging at this point?
I don't believe so. We were very clear. We spoke to the people of Wales, and we spoke to them through our channels, through the press conferences, through all the interviews that the First Minister and other ministers did. We made sure that we didn't confine that to Welsh media. So the First Minister would do hundreds of interviews and, Good Morning Britain, BBC Breakfast, BBC Network. And what we were trying to do from this stage, well, before this, but particularly from this stage onwards, was really to educate the London media about the reality of what a devolved pandemic was going to look like. And we invested really quite a bit of resource into doing that. And to be fair, as time went on, I think the UK-based media that we see in Wales did become much better at reflecting the differences across the Four Nations.
Thank you. We're actually going to come to that point now. I'm going to ask you some questions about differentiation in communications campaigns. You note in your witness statement the issue of England-specific campaigns being launched in UK-wide publications. You explain that in light of this, the Cabinet Office made efforts at very short notice to restrict the media buying to England only, but this gave an early indication of the complexity of delivering different messages to different parts of the UK. Is it fair then to say that the Cabinet Office did attempt to help the Welsh Government and the other devolved nations when it became aware of issues such as these?
Yes, they did. And I have to say my relations, as I say in my statement, but for the record, my relations with civil servants in Cabinet Office and other devolved administrations, even when there were policy differences between administrations, were always polite, respectful, and we worked very well together. Cabinet Office, I think, did what they could. I think one area of frustration, I think it's picked up by Professor Henderson in her report to Module 2, was quite frequently the UK government, the Downing Street briefings, even when they were on devolved matters, barely referenced England, and of course those were broadcast across the BBC and other outlets that cover the whole of Wales, and we did make strenuous efforts at every level, including First Ministerial, to try and appeal to them to be more clear. We didn't have that problem in the sense that it was very clear that we were speaking to people in Wales.
Thank you. Could we now please look at document INQ 000282-289, please? Thank you. This is a report summarising the findings of a focus group, and the report's dated the 21st of May of 2020. If we turn to page 3 of this document, please, and the first and second bullet points there. They state that participants voice regret and concern that the UK is no longer taking a joined-up approach to managing the pandemic across all 4 nations. All participants voiced a strong preference for a joined-up UK-wide response. It was felt that taking different approaches had caused confusion and risks leading to an increase in the spread of the virus. What was your view of this feedback at the time, that being May 2020?
So this was a really important kind of way of taking the temperature. I think the point I would make is that the Welsh Government's preference was for a joined-up UK-wide response, where there would be greater coordination of approaches between the 4 nations. I think, as Jane Runnacles said earlier on, once the 1984 Public Health Act is brought in, then divergence becomes a theoretical and then a practical possibility. I think later in this focus group, I think the participants were also very clear that they favoured the Welsh, more cautious approach to what was happening in England, and I think that's quite important to note. I don't think, if you look at the report as a whole, that is not a criticism of the Welsh Government, but they are voicing a preference that the situation we are now in is potentially complex and confusing.
Did you take any steps to address the point raised by this feedback at the time?
We just redoubled our efforts to make sure that people in Wales had clarity about the rules as they applied to them.
Thank you.
Of course, it isn't just differences between what the Welsh Government were doing and the UK Government were doing. Scotland did things differently.
Yes. Yes, no, that's entirely true. I mean, the big issue that we had was the porosity of the media border, particularly between England and Wales. But yes, from a citizen's point of view, there would also be, the First Minister of Scotland would be on the 6 o'clock news announcing a slightly different, be it sequencing or set of rules. Yes.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to ask you about Wales-specific communication during the pandemic. You explain in your witness statement that you took a decision that communications within specific pandemic-related programmes would be undertaken using the overarching Keep Wales Safe brand in order to build on the trust and recognition that campaign had accrued. That campaign was developed by the Welsh Government in May of 2020 as what you term a distinctively Welsh brand to communicate the regulations in Wales. Can you please explain how you arrived at the decision to launch the Keep Wales Safe brand?
Yes. So this goes back to the email that we saw earlier on, which was at the point of divergence. We couldn't simply, at that point, it was not tenable or correct to follow UK government messaging. And if there was to be broader divergence, then it needed to be very clear to people in Wales who that we were speaking to them. Keep Wales Safe was a phrase that I think the First Minister had been using in some of his even quite early press conferences. And what we found interesting was in our focus groups, when we asked people, what do you want? What do you want from your government? Overwhelmingly, they said, we want to be kept safe and we want our families to be safe. So we then worked that up very rapidly in May into a campaign. We tested that back with the focus groups and there was, they said, yes, this speaks to us in terms of a Welsh identity, but also, you know, the imperative that we want. And I think that enabled us to have an umbrella brand across all our kind of communications activities across all sectors. The really important thing with Keep Well Safe is that we flexed it at different times. So we were looking at the data modelling from TAC and TAG, and if it became clear that there was a large potential second or even third wave coming, we would be flexing our campaign planning to have a much harder edged approach. So maybe in the summer months, it would be let's keep well safe together with that very cautious but more permissive view on meeting up. In the winter, when prevalence was higher, we moved to a much harder edged disrupt the transmission to keep well safe. So yeah, we found it to be a really kind of useful, you know, a really powerful approach. And I just would say also how bought in our public sector partners were to it, because we did it in a way that enabled them to adapt that content very easily for their kind of local areas with an overarching national brand.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on one thing that you talked about earlier in your statement. That was the use of social listening reports. Can we please bring up document INQ 000282290, please? Now, this is an example of a social listening report. It's from the 2nd of November of 2020. If we go to page 1 of the document, under the heading Topic Mention in Wales, we can see there the nature of the summaries produced by the social listening research. If we can go to the bottom of page 1, under the heading Firebreak, we can then see snapshots of the top issues that have been picked up on. Is it fair to say that the social listening exercise produces a very high-level summary and then pulls out specific quotations? You mentioned earlier that you thought these reports were particularly useful. Can you explain? Is that right? Yeah. Did you mean to say that, or have I misconstrued you?
No, they were useful. I think with social monitoring, they are a useful general indicator of sentiment. But I think we would never advise ministers and our senior officials, to treat them as being necessarily representative of public sentiment as a whole. It is a useful additional and quite immediate tool alongside polling and focus groups, but also the feedback that we were getting from our partners as to sentiment on the ground in relation to, for example, compliance with regulations.
Thank you. I'd now like to ask some specific questions about the public messaging campaigns implemented during the pandemic. If I may please begin by asking, why was the focus of public messaging on protecting the NHS and not on other sectors, for example, care homes?
So that campaign was very much a UK government campaign. It was launched, I think, in March. My understanding is that from what I've read, the polling that they were doing, because they did even more kind of polling and focus grouping than we did, indicated that a primary driver of people's behaviours were to protect the NHS, and that in order to gain the kind of compliance with the regulations and the stay-home rules, that would be the primary driver. But we weren't closely involved in the development of that campaign. We assisted with the way that it ran in Wales.
Thank you. Second, were communications always delivered in the Welsh language? Do you consider there was parity with English language communications?
Yes. We took bilingualism. Well, we have a statutory responsibility as a government to communicate in both languages and not treat one less favourably than the other. It was. And one of the things that we did was, and we've kind of built on this since the pandemic, is rather than just slavishly translate English into Welsh, you can actually have more kind of Welsh idioms that would appeal to kind of Welsh speakers as well. So yes, it was a really important part of our work.
Thank you. Reports provided to the inquiry have also commented on how the government's use of the term following the science was very damaging. To what extent was this a message that featured in the Welsh Government communication strategy?
I wouldn't necessarily say it was part of the strategy. It was used by ministers at kind of press conferences and in interviews. From my point of view, having seen how carefully ministers weighed the kind of scientific and medical evidence that was in front of them, that was their decision to use that.
Do you have a view on the impact of that kind of messaging had on the accountability of political decision makers and the public perception of who made decisions?
I think it was very, very clear who was accountable for the decisions made in Wales through our communications.
Thank you. I'd now like to ask some questions about the effectiveness of Wales communications strategy. You explain in your witness statement that your focus group work and your polling enabled you to assess the extent to which the messages and communications were resonating with the public and the extent to which people were accessing those messages and the likely reaction to potential future restrictions in different circumstances. Can we please bring up document INQ 0000666103, please? This is a further focus group report, and this report is dated the 13th of May of 2020. Can we please turn to page 2? Thank you. I see that we have that. That is a summary of the key findings. I'd just like to look at 2 in particular. The first is at paragraph 4, and that states that despite some initial confusion, participants felt the distinction between the UK and Welsh Government announcements is relatively clear. To what extent do you consider that that was due to your communication strategy?
As I said to the inquiry, that was our objective, and it was good to see that being reflected in the back to us in the focus groups.
Thank you. Could we now please bring up document INQ 0003277735, please? This is Dr. Goodall's statement. Can we please turn to paragraph 463, which is at page 115 of the statement? Thank you. In this part of Dr. Goodall's statement, he summarises the reach of the Keep Wales Safe campaign. He states that it was significant. For example, between April and September 2021, it reached the following percentages of the Welsh population, and there is therein set out a breakdown of different groups and how the messaging was being received. Of note, in relation to the C2, D and E groups, the reach is 93.45%. That's in fact the lowest percentage in the summary. Why do you think the campaign had the lowest reach amongst individuals in those groups?
I couldn't say for sure. What I would say is that these reach numbers are very, very high across the board for any other campaign that a government would run. I'm not sure. It could be a mix of the media buy, but no, these are very, very high numbers generally.
Thank you. If we then please look at paragraph 464 of the statement, that's at page 116. Thank you. This states that in the tracker poll carried out in mid-August of 2021, awareness of Keep Wales Safe peaked at 81% of all adults in Wales. Do you have a view on why this figure is lower than the figures in the previous paragraph?
Yes. So reach is a theoretical percentage that is generated by if a campaign runs across these channels at this frequency, that is what the reach of the campaign is. Awareness, which is really important, is more along the lines of if you ask people to spontaneously say, what is the Welsh Government's key message or what is their campaign, if they reply to you, it's Keep Wales Safe, that is the awareness level, and 81% is very good for that, for any campaign.
So putting in, again, sorry to revert to Scotland, but just so I'm following. So I heard a bit in Scotland about the FACT Vax campaign, and So had I looked at the reach figures, they might have been quite high because that was the theoretical number that the campaign...
Yes.
But then when people were asked if they understood what FACT stood for,
Yes.
they didn't.
They didn't. So that would be...
So that's the awareness figure.
That would be more on the awareness figure, yes. I mean, our decision was we used Keep Well Safe as an umbrella brand, as I said, and the protective behaviours would sit underneath there rather than have an acronym.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, thank you. If I can now please ask that document INQ 000388424 is brought up, please. I'm sorry, so I think that's probably a mistake.
Has it all been redacted?
Sections of it have. If I can ask you please to look at a message on page 2, please. And this is a message of the 14th of March of 2020 that is timed at 14:48:39. This is a message between you and Shan Morgan on WhatsApp. And in this message, there is reference to concerns being raised about coordination and inconsistency of approach between different parts of the government. Yep. I don't propose to read the message out, but you can see certainly the text of the message and the concerns that are raised regarding coordination. Do you agree that coordination and consistency between the different parts of the Welsh Government at a time of increasing concern around the virus was vitally important?
My recollection of this period was it wasn't so much coordination of the government's approach to tackling the virus. My recollection is that we were at a stage when the questions around whether people should work from home or not were becoming very, very live. I think it was more there were some departments that were telling their staff, you should work from home, others saying, no, come into the office, I think. And I think the concern, because we had to be, an exemplar as a Welsh government in terms of that. And I think it was more around kind of the internal processes.
So would you agree that an inconsistent approach from within the Welsh Government would have also been confusing for the public and would impact on public perception as regards the severity of the virus and trust in the government?
Yes, I think that was the concern.
Can I please then just ask you to look at the message at 14:57:07? Shan Morgan therefore says, OK, thanks, sometimes inconsistency is actually flexibility. Why would you agree with that statement, given what you've just said?
This was so there were people. I think a blanket work from home. There were some of us who attended the office throughout most of the pandemic on the basis that there needed to be really close, and things were moving so quickly that there needed to be really close kind of coordination. So I guess there was an element of there needed to be some flexibility that people could. But I think the point about consistency is really important.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My lady, that concludes my questions.
Thank you very much. I think there is a question, some more questions.
Thank you, lady. Good afternoon, I think. Toby, Mr Mason. My name is Kirsten Heaven and I represent the Covid-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. So can I start with the topic of face coverings, please? The day is the 9th of June and it's the day of Vaughan Gething's press statement on face coverings. No doubt you will remember that. Just to give us all a quick reminder, 5 days before the UK government had announced face coverings were mandatory on public transport in England. And in this statement, obviously, we know Vaughan Gething is simply saying that face coverings will be recommended where social distancing is not possible. You're nodding your head. No doubt you remember that well.
I do.
Okay, thank you. So we have some very clear divergence there. Before I ask you about your email communications on that day, trying to sort out the press statement, can I just ask you to confirm, we've seen some WhatsApps, I put them to Shan Morgan, we understand they're with you, but your number, I think, was redacted.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah,
that's
so
correct.
can I just ask you, just if we could bring them up on screen, just so that we can confirm you are the person speaking to Shan Morgan. It's INQ 30388424 Milady, this is the communication around banging of heads on the morning of the 9th and face mask militancy. There we go. So if we can just zoom in, please. It's quite hard to see. It's at the very bottom. There we go. Hope all goes well at the press conference. All sounded a bit muddled. And then we think it's you, saying a number of heads banged together, thrown an hour ring around it, as hope as I possibly can to avoid the knock-on. Still pretty worried. Transport colleagues in the loop from the TFW side. Is that you?
That is yes.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not going to ask you about that.
Oh, okay.
Just to correct the record so that we know that it is the Director of Communications that's speaking to Shan Morgan.
Yep.
So, again, before I get the email up that I'm allowed to ask you about, a little bit more context. 5th of June, the World Health Organization publishes advice on face coverings, and we know that it recommended that governments should be saying that you should wear a face covering, but it also recommended medical masks for vulnerable populations. So that was people over 60 with underlying health conditions. So let's look at the series of emails between yourself, Liz Bennett, and others trying to sort out the press statement on the day Vaughan Gethin gives his announcement. So it's INQ 30215458 and it's 0007, please. Let's start at 0006. Now, this is the email from yourself there. I'm just going to read it to you. Has it come up on screen? This is the 9th of June at 10 o'clock. So you say, I'm really concerned about the handling of the 12:30 press conference following the 9 a.m. call. I don't believe that any announcement beyond a position on non-mandatory face coverings following the WHO change of position is deliverable in comms terms in a way that will not raise very significant questions from a large number of stakeholders in the public, including those brought up at the meeting. As raised at the meeting, the tag paper will bring with it a huge number of queries and demands for us to take a policy position with really major implications, like the provision of medical grade masks to vulnerable groups. Can we distill the announcement to a series of bullet points now and work on those urgently and agree with MHSS that any questions beyond these, and specifically on the use of medical grade masks, will be pushed beyond today to the more detailed sectoral guidance developed with stakeholders? Okay. Now, you appear to be concerned here that if the Welsh Government were to go out in public on the 9th of June, so in other words, Vaughan Gethin, and on the website, and tell the vulnerable people in Wales that the WHO are now recommending that they should have medical grade masks, that this would cause really major implications for policy. Is that right? That was your concern at this point in time?
Yes, that's what the email says, yes.
Now, what we know eventually happened is that a press statement went out. I think Vaughan Gethin has probably given his statement to the public. He makes no mention that the WHO are telling vulnerable people to have medical masks. I'll come on to that in a moment. But the press statement that goes onto the government website is just a few pages up. So if you scroll up, please, there's a few iterations, but the final version that goes out is at 002. And it goes on to 003. So if we can just look at 002's there, 3-layer face coverings, and 003 goes down. Now, we don't need to read it, but you can take it from me that there is no reference in this press statement to the fact that the WHO were recommending that vulnerable people should have access to medical masks. Can you assist us with why that was the case, and was that on your advice, that that information should not go to the Welsh public?
So I'm kind of reading this as we go along.
I appreciate that, yeah.
If this statement says we're following WHO advice, I would assume that that recommendation is that people in Wales should wear 3-layer face coverings. In the previous email that we looked at, there was reference to a TAG paper, the Technical Advisory Group paper.
Yeah, I'll come on to that in a moment, because that piece of information is also missing from the TAG paper. And I was going to ask you about that separately, but
okay.
If we just focus on the initial question, which is that the WHO, we know, was saying vulnerable people had to have access to medical grade masks. It's missing from Vaughan Gething's press statement. It's missing from the press statement on the Welsh Government website. So I'm just seeking your assistance as to whether or not that was on your advice, because obviously I've just read to you an email which says that the issue of medical grade masks will be pushed beyond today. So I'm just seeking to understand, is that something that you advised needed to stay out of the press, statements needed to not be given to the Welsh public and pushed to a later date?
We have these emails. I don't know what the sequence of events were on this morning. What I do know is that while there were I could give communications advice about the way particular things would land, ultimately this would have been signed off by Flisbenny and others as being the correct government position.
But would you accept from me, looking at your email, it's very clear, isn't it, that you knew that the WHO were talking about vulnerable people needing access to medical grade masks? You obviously knew that on that day, didn't you? It's in your email.
I presume I did from the email. I don't. I haven't gone back and looked at the WHO advice itself at this stage.
Would you have drafted Vaughan Gething's statement to the press on that day?
No.
Who would have drafted that then?
It would have been drafted by the relevant press officer, I think.
And I did say I was going to assist you on the tag paper. So the tag paper that was eventually published on the 9th of June made no reference to the WHO recommendation that vulnerable people should have access to medical masks. Now that was the final version that was published, but what I want to understand from you is, do you recollect, was there an earlier version of the tag paper which did talk about vulnerable people having access to medical masks? And the reason I ask you that is because if we look at your email again, and that's at 0007, it does reference the tag paper bringing a huge number of queries and demands, like the provision of medical grade masks to vulnerable people. So that would seem to suggest that at one point there was a tag paper talking about vulnerable people having medical masks, and that might have then been removed from the one that was eventually published. Can you assist on that?
So I was not closely involved with development of tag papers. I didn't sit on tag. I don't recall. This is kind of a note after a discussion. But again, whatever tag published in the end was their responsibility.
Okay. And you could only work on that, presumably, because you're not the scientist, essentially.
I'm definitely not a scientist.
No. Milady, I've got one more question. Have I got time? If not,
Yes,
I won't
certainly.
ask it. So let's just get through these very quickly then. So they're just straight questions you'll be pleased to hear. Why were media communications initially so focused on hand washing with no focus on COVID-19 being airborne and asymptomatic? So we're looking here at March to June 2020.
That was the scientific advice from SAGE and the chief medical officers at the time.
Okay. Again, was there any discussion on public messaging around mitigation for airborne or asymptomatic transmission? So do you remember when that discussion came in?
Ventilation, I don't remember exactly when ventilation became a greater issue. I remember it becoming more and more important, and that's why I think we referred to it earlier on, HF, hands, face, space, air. Came in. I would say on that we incorporated that into our messaging, but it was a good example that the UK government worked up a campaign called Let's Stop COVID Hanging Around. It was quite a dramatic campaign, and that was an example of a campaign that we were very happy to run in Wales by the UK government because it addressed one of the key emerging preventative behaviours. And
then finally, in late 2021, the Welsh Government ran its Stop COVID Hanging Around campaign, and that was, by that stage, to stress that COVID was airborne. So did you ensure that the Welsh Government's communication on this was aligned with Public Health Wales and NHS Wales communications to challenge any misleading or confusing guidance from Public Health Wales that might not have aligned with what the Welsh Government was saying?
I wasn't aware of any advice that didn't align with that. As I say, this was a good example of, as the science developed and the understanding of the virus developed, the communications adapted with it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Evans. Ms Fubister.
Thank you, my lady. Good morning, Mr Mason. I represent John's Campaign and Care Rights UK. In your witness statement and today, you've spoken about communication with the vulnerable groups, and you refer to particular efforts with Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, given the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on them. Were you aware that COVID-19 and its response had a disproportionate impact on the care sector? For example, that in the first 3 months of the pandemic, nearly 40% of COVID deaths were of people in care homes.
Yes, I mean, the issue of care homes is very live within the government, yes.
And what particular efforts were made to communicate with those involved in the care sector, be it carers, people being cared for at home, or people living in care homes? Were particular efforts made, and if so, what were they?
So I divide that into two quick parts. Obviously, all our campaign work around preventative behaviours was aimed at the entire population, which would include those working in care homes. Where there were more specific kind of technical sector-specific advice to those working in care homes and those operating care homes, they would have come on a kind of stakeholder basis from the Director of Social Services within the Welsh Government out into that sector.
So you refer to specific stakeholder perspective from the Director of Social Services. What communications would have come from them in relation to things that might affect the care sector?
I don't know specifically. My role was around the kind of the entirety of external communications, but I would imagine that there was that information as knowledge of the virus and its impact developed, that there would be communication at that level between the Welsh Government, Care Forum Wales and the sector more generally.
So it wasn't part of your role specifically to deal with communications with the care sector specifically?
No.
Are you aware that concerns have been raised that communications relevant to the care sector were inconsistent, confusing and unclear?
I wasn't aware of that specifically.
Then you might not be able to help with my next question, but do you have any ideas about what could be done to improve clarity of communications with the care sector?
I don't. In terms of that sort of specific sector, what I do know is that we tried at all times to be very, very clear in all our communications to the whole country about what the level of risk was and the steps people could take to protect themselves.
Did you have any expert advice on the communication needs of people with in the care sector?
Not to my knowledge.
And finally, was there a single person who was responsible for ensuring that guidance and communications relating to restrictions were clear and consistent?
Do you mean for the care sector or more generally?
In general, or the care sector specifically?
In general terms, we as a government had a collective responsibility for making sure that the communications around all regulations and behaviours were clear. On the care sector more specifically, that would sit, I think, with probably the relevant Welsh Government department or the local authority Director of Social Services.
And do you think it might be helpful going forward for there to be someone specific targeted with ensuring clear consistency in communications for future situations like this?
Yes, I mean, that was ultimately my responsibility and responsibility of the wider government.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms Mason. I think we've put you through the difficult task of marking your own homework for long enough. So thank you for your help. I shall return at 1:45.